Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I am Elizabeth Press, owner of B3M Labs, and I am here today with Antonia Landi, product operations consultant and coach. And thank you so much for joining us. We are going to talk about why the digital world needs product operations, and they need it really badly. So let's get into this amazing subject. Antonia, tell us a bit about yourself and how you got so interested in digital products and product operations.
Of course. So, first of all, thank you for having me. Like you just said, I'm a product operations consultant and coach, and I kind of came into product ops, I think, because I was always just a person that was annoyed the quickest, or maybe the most easily annoyed when things weren't working. So I would often take it upon myself to actually fix things in how my team was getting work done. I'm not sure I really joined product management specifically to be at the forefront of building digital products necessarily. I think for me, it was the discipline itself and the many different facets it has that really attracted me. And obviously a natural next step then was to build products customers loved. But I think my first love has been product management as a discipline, and my second has been how to make that discipline shine the brightest, really.
Okay, great. And what is product operations?
So I've actually gone through a few different definitions as I started working in product ops. And I think my first one was always to tell people, well, I make product managers' lives easy, right? Because why wouldn't you want me on your team if that's my USP? But I think over time, I've realized that, well, sometimes I actually make it quite a bit harder because I ask people to change their behavior. I might ask them to do something new, or I might ask them to stop doing something. Nowadays, I say product ops is there to foster product management excellence. And that really means allowing product managers to do their best job.
Okay, and I have a question about why product operations is a little bit new or even controversial, because operations is actually a core discipline of management. Every MBA
Right.
program has this, and it's been around for at least 100 years.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. We've had conversations about this in the past, right? And it's a very interesting point that even in digital companies that focus on logistics or that have a logistics component or have some sort of physical product, they get operations, right? Because something needs to happen in a specific order. Things need to go from A to B, and that is something that needs to be managed. That's something that needs to be operationalized. As soon as we start talking about knowledge work, that notion seems to disappear entirely. And now we can ask ourselves why this is happening. And I'm honestly not entirely sure myself, but it's a very, very interesting trend.
What would you say is the core value add of product operations?
So I have a theory that product management has gotten incredibly more complex in, let's say, even the last decade, right? People have to do more things on average. I mean, even the competitive landscape looks a lot more different. There are hundreds of millions of digital products all competing for largely the same pool of customers, right? So you need to be extremely good at what you do. You need to be extremely consistent. And on top of that, we have things like remote work, hybrid work. We have things like new managers stepping into roles that maybe they may not be well equipped for. We have juniors joining the workforce. We have millions and millions of frameworks to choose from, right? And amidst all of that confusion, how do you deliver value to your customer in a way that benefits your business? And how do you do it better than your competition, right? I think, to me, product operations is actually really a competitive advantage, because you can be consistent, you can continuously deliver value, and you can do it in a way that benefits your employees as well.
And you've been the main driver of the product operations manifesto.
Yeah.
And it sounds a lot to me, at least in the name, like the agile manifesto. Can you tell me how you got to this idea, and were you actually inspired by the agile manifesto?
Yeah, so when I wanted to become a product manager, I had been in tech for a little while, but I really wanted, my goal was product management. And even as I became a product owner and then a product manager, sometimes I would get extremely frustrated with the way we were doing things. And honestly, my solace was to go back and reread the Agile Manifesto, because to me, it is still so relevant and it is still so important. And so, of course, there is some inspiration taken there, right? Like I find the idea of a manifesto very powerful. And we have taken some inspiration in format as well, right? Like X over Y, that sort of thing. Because the Agile Manifesto has actually played such a large part in my career and who or how I wanted to get work done. How the Product Ops Manifesto came about, I literally got a bunch of people together that I've been talking about product ops with for what feels like eons, right? But we did it in about 3 weeks in total, which was very deliberate, because I really wanted this to be out there and useful for other people. And I think the value really just comes from having an artifact that is ours, that says this is what we're here to achieve and this is what we need in order to be able to achieve that. And having this as a conversation starter has been really powerful.
It was impressive watching the development of these conversations. And I, as a spectator, it seems like you hit a nerve of a lot of people who were working in similar roles as yourself. And I thought that might have been a driver of why it went so quickly and was so successful. It's been adopted, right, by some companies.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also wonderful to see, you know, like people getting in touch with us and saying, I co-defined my role together with my manager on the back of the manifesto, or, you know, I wanted to have a team charter and we're using the manifesto as an inspiration. Like, it's been so amazing to see people actually adopt this and make it their own. And it's something we didn't have before. And all it took was 3 weeks, really. And it was, yeah, it's great.
So then I have a question, because you and I have been working in Berlin for quite a few years.
Yeah.
And we've seen, especially in Corona, a lot of these hyper growth startups.
Mm-hmm.
And I at least have noticed that sometimes processes or operations are like a dirty word almost.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like feeding vegetables sometimes to a kid telling you know, a senior manager in a hyper-growth startup in Berlin that they need to adopt some form of operations or process
Right.
at the same time that they want to scale. And this to me is absolutely amazing, and sort of sad in a way.
Yeah, it's a very interesting discussion. I absolutely have the same experience. Even when I used to work in quality assurance, and my thing was I would go into startups, I was the first QA person. So naturally, I would have to set up processes around how to do quality. And even back then, I wasn't allowed to say process. You know, people would immediately disengage, or like it would take half a second for somebody to tell me, oh no, but we are a startup. What we need to do is we need to get work done. We need to ship stuff. We don't need process, right? And so it was going to overcomplicate things. But I find that so interesting. The problem I have with that is, I can just call it something else. I can say systems of how we do work. I can say ways of working. At the end of the day, we're still talking process. It really doesn't matter what it's called. But it really is this kind of reluctance of companies to quote unquote grow up, right? And I think actually a lot of companies that do have product operations, especially in Central Europe, is because they got to this tipping point where what they were doing was no longer sustainable. It no longer worked, right? Working with 20 people looks a lot different than working with 200 people. And working with 200 looks a lot different than working with 2,000. And you do need different systems of work, right? It becomes increasingly complex. It becomes increasingly complicated. It becomes increasingly more important that everybody knows what the mission is, what the strategy is, that everybody is going in the same direction. So really this reluctance of wanting to, grow up, for lack of a better term, is something I find quite problematic in Berlin, to be honest.
What I find very interesting in the news these days is the number of strikes that are starting to happen in different digital businesses. And I think this has a lot to do with operations, because it has a lot to do with worker safety, with hours you spend doing a task, and these sorts of things that will lead people to want to strike. I mean, there's other issues as well that are leading that, but and also there's if we see factories around Berlin that are run by people who actually the startup scene does look up to. And we're seeing a lot of safety issues happening in these factories. Is that impacting how people look at operations? Because it's not just a nice to have now. It's actually, let's be compliant now.
Yeah, it is. It is very interesting. And I think the thing that fascinates me is that when you start talking about issues like safety, compliance, even things like GDPR, right? Things that will meaningfully negatively affect you in ways of a fine or a PR disaster, whatever it might be, suddenly people are very adamant about process, right? And suddenly people are very eager to get everybody to follow these sorts of processes and guidelines. And again, going back to this question, like, why are we not doing this for knowledge work just because, like, do we then actively say it has lower value? Is it simply because it is something intangible? But then again, if we're talking about money spent, product and tech teams are expensive. Why wouldn't you want them to be effective, as effective as they can be?
That is a really good question. And that brings me to my next point. How do you actually measure effectiveness of product operations?
Yeah, it's very interesting. And I think it's not one that has one single satisfying answer. I think the thing you need to ask yourself first is, where do you want to be? Where do you want to go? What kind of expertise or capability do you want to put forward? And then those are things you can measure. Like, if you want to be the kind of company that literally speaks to customers every single week, right? That's something you can measure. But I think for product operations, my approach has always been quantitative and qualitative, first of all, but also measuring sentiment. So how do the people in the organization feel about how easy or how difficult it is to get work done? But also measure things on a project basis, right? If I adopt a new tool, or if I introduce a new tool to the organization that helps us communicate more effectively, for example, well, how can I measure that? Do I measure how many times people access the tool? Do I measure how many updates are being shared? Is there a way I can measure things like a reduction in silos, right? Can I measure how many cross-department meetings are happening, or how many cross-department initiatives actually see the light of day? I think sometimes it's about getting a little bit creative, but the most important thing is always to understand what's the point of what you're doing. And then secondarily, how can you measure that?
I definitely agree with you. I've been thinking about return on capital employed, and
Yeah.
there are answers to these questions that the business world has thought of, that are in many MBA programs. So it's just interesting that we're having this discussion now. So and talking about business goals and how you match that to KPIs. I think
Yeah.
the CAC payback period.
Yeah.
Uh, that's an amazing one that I hope that more people use in the future. So what do people do on Tuesday morning at 10 if they want to get started on product operations?
So honestly, I really think the first step is to identify where you want to be or what is lacking, right? I mean, a lot of the time, product operations in a company gets instantiated because things are on fire, right? And at that point, to a certain extent, it's almost too late. Like, you should have started before the fire engulfed your entire organization, right? At that point, you will be spending considerable time firefighting. But I think with everything, and to me, this is why it's so important that I have had product management experience, and I'm still very much a product manager, but I apply my product management skills to organization. So what is the problem, right? And the problem is never something like people aren't reading the newsletter. That's not a problem. What is the problem the newsletter is trying to solve? Like really, really getting to the core of what are we trying to do here? What are we trying to foster or facilitate here? And why is it not working? And really, it's a product mindset kind of process, actually, to understand what's the problem. Is this problem acute enough for us to want to solve? How might we solve it? And how might we test that solution? And then how do we measure it? And I think doing that in a small scope at first, and this is something I have done my entire career, right? I don't need to have the approval of my manager or of my manager's manager. I might be able to sell something as an experiment. I might be able to test something with my own team and see how things go and learn from there and keep going. And if it goes well, maybe other teams might want to adopt this thing that I've come up with. And I think that's something that I really urge everybody to think about. If you don't have that product operational support in your organization, it is up to you to make your own life better.
I really love that. It's very empowering that you're the one who could do it. So what are some secrets to your success?
Goodness, I'm not sure I have any secrets. I think I'm very enthusiastic. So if somebody tells me about an idea, about something they want to collaborate on, something they want to do together, I will very, very rarely say no. But I think this is also, this collaboration over competition aspect is really something that has enriched my life so much, especially now that it feels like more and more people are freelancing. Maybe some people feel like this is my competition. These are people I need to be wary of. And really, these are your partners, right? These are the people that you can elevate and that can elevate you. So I think for me, collaboration, and I think secondarily, community, right? Learning from each other, creating spaces where people can find each other and can find their tribe. Those are two things that have been, first of all, instrumental to my career and to my success. And secondly, just also very personally rewarding.
Okay, great. And how can people get in contact with you?
I'm on LinkedIn more often than I should be, so that's definitely a good place to find me. I also have a small blog where I write about product operations. And if you're in Berlin, it's very likely that I'm going to be at quite a few product meetups.
Okay, great. Thanks, Antonia. This was a wonderful conversation. And thank you, everyone else, for listening.
Thank you so much for having me.